Mr. Button Clips! Mr. Button Clips! Mr. Button Clips! Mr. Button Clips!
So year 12, I thought in order to consolidate what we've been doing the past couple of lessons, where you've been dealing with fragments of the violets and we've talked vaguely about the violets, I thought it's probably better today to consolidate and reconcile what we see in the violets rather than explore yet another poem before we move on. So I'm going to try to talk you through the violets to make sure that you have a comprehensive understanding of what this poem is about. You've got a fairly small annotation on the right hand side, and I'll try to emphasize the points that are crucial as we go through the video. In terms of central ideas in the violets, like the other poems we've explored so far, it is dealing with that dichotomy of innocence versus experience and how a child goes through the transition. In this case, we're looking at the adult reflecting on childhood, which marries up quite well to what Heaney does in his poetry, where he is sort of trying to glorify and idealize childhood yet again. There are a few other dichotomies as well to look at in this poem. It's looking at obviously the past and the present, and using memories as kind of the link between that. It looks as the contrast between life and death, contrast between memories and reality, and also happiness and sadness. So between all of these sort of dichotomies or contrast, there's a sense of reconciliation going through it, and perhaps that reconciliation is coming through by the sort of Catholic confidence and belief in a higher being that's going to be there to console and comfort. It's also interesting to see how Harwood plays with the idea of time and place, and the idea of transience, or maybe mutability, overcoming these boundaries and us shifting from one place to another and one time to another quite seamlessly. So the poem opens with two rather short sentences, possibly echoing the cold, disengaged tone of the adult, and we'll see how that's later on contrasted to the young, youthful tone, which is emphasized through long sentences and quite extensive use of enjambment. We then contrast that to a childish visual image of the melting west being striped like ice cream. So we picture the visual image of the sky in multiple colors and this sort of image of it melting. So the metaphor of the west melting, the sky melting, becomes a simile with the ice cream, which potentially represents the adult refusing to relinquish childhood and still claiming and trying to hold on to some elements of the childish persona that they once had. I missed the reference before to ashes and loam, but that contrast between so we subvert the traditional ashes to ashes and dust to dust, which are both about decomposition or destruction, whereas here we get ashes, which are potentially dealing with death, and loam, which is highly fertile and potentially a symbol of rejuvenation and rebirth and new shoots coming out in spring. So kind of uniting those two contrasts there as well. The blackbird that steps in to ignore the highbrow musical image, oral image of Scarlatti's song, which the persona is trying to whistle. And we conclude the first stanza by describing the light and the sky as ambiguous, both to emphasize an element here of uncertainty, but also to create a bridge into this memory and the reminiscence of the past, which is signaled by the indentation, where we move from the left-aligned present tense adult speaker into her childhood self as a young child. As a young child. So we then move into this childhood memory of a child that's fallen asleep in the afternoon and wakes up and is frustrated by the fact that she's lost so much time in the afternoon. So we're again playing with the ambiguity of time by placing this towards nightfall. As we discussed previously in class, Harwood likes the idea of the cycle of a day to represent the cycle of a life. So we're looking at a young child, but towards nightfall, which is slightly contradictory in the way that Harwood uses those images. We'll see, just like we had some oral imagery in the first stanza with the trill of Scarlatti's song, we now have more sounds in this second stanza. We have the mother calling, and then we have the mother laughing and the child sobbing. So we can hear the sounds of the household, all of which are fairly innocent and fairly normal kind of household sounds. In the third stanza, the mother carries the child downstairs, and she brings her down to see spring violets in their loamy bed. So in this case, we move from there's no ashes here, it's just pure the loam, the rebirth in the spring violets. So it's all about rebirth and regrowth. There's purity here, no death in sight for this child in this stanza. But the child is hungry and cross, and wasn't interested in their sweetness or the comfort that is offered by the mother, or even when my father, whistling, more sound, came from work. But instead she uses her tears to scold the things she couldn't grasp or name, that when I slept had stolen from me those hours of unreturning light. The fourth stanza is quite dense in its religious connotations and its Christian imagery. So the family goes into my father's house, where they light the lamp, and they took the supper, and then is sent to innocent sleep. So there's that sense of not only getting the security through religion, but also the fact that community or the ceremony that precedes communion gives them a purity and an innocence that they might have lost previously. It's interesting how this fourth stanza, concludes. Whilst it's positive and it's dealing with innocence and light and positive activity and security in the father's house, we are again at dusk, and we're surrendering pink and white, which could be that ice cream from stanza 1, to blurring darkness, which presumably is not the happy time, but rather we're leaving that positive and going towards the end of the day, to the end of life, presumably. We've dealt with stanza 1 being aligned on the left-hand margin, stanza 2, 3, and 4 being indented slightly. The bridge into the next stanza is further indented. Years cannot move. So we're kind of now moving into more of a philosophical stance. We're not dealing with the past or the present, but rather this is more of a truism or a sort of a statement about this is just a matter of fact. So fairly high level of certitude here. There's no way that years can change, or that death's disorienting scale can distort those lamplit presences. The image of the scale of death being disorienting is kind of interesting in terms of the proximity of death does change the way we perceive things. If we are close to death, then that's the scale in terms of it seems like it's fairly close to hand. Say you're 5 years away from the end of life, those 5 years seems like nothing, even if you've got 85 years behind you. At the same time, if you are a 5-year-old, then the perception, in terms of life goes forever and ever. And there's that sense of how the scale that we're operating on, this is a scale that we find at the bottom of a map, not a scale that you use to weigh your cooking ingredients on, does tend to distort how we perceive time, and that we may see things as extra far away or very close to us, depending on how we our sense of scale is distorted simply by the proximity of death. Just like the objects in the rearview mirror, according to the sticker, may be closer than they appear. We then get to experience one last lamplit presence, one more thing, one more memory that's fleetingly passing for this speaker as she's bending down to smell the violets. And that's a child with milk and storybook, a father bending down to inhale the gathered flowers. So the child has picked some violets, brought them to Dad. Dad's leaning over to smell them while stroking the mother's gold brown hair. So there's a great sense of harmony in the family, their happiness, the joy that's there, which obviously is brought back by the combination of the smelling of the flowers and this possibly the sound of the stone curlews calling from Kedron Brook. It's interesting though how the one olfactory image, even though this poem is obviously inspired by the scent of the violets, the fact that she's leant down in stanza 1 and smelt the frail, melancholy flowers, so they're imbued by that, the speaker's sense of being old and fragile, so there's a sense of pathetic fallacy in that opening stanza. Yet we don't see any other olfactory imagery, even though the sense of smell seems to be what's inspired the entire poem. We don't see any other olfactory imagery until this very last line, when a faint scent of violet drift in air. So it's as if Harwood is kind of hinting at the sensory overload that we get in some modern philosophers, but also, for instance, in Marcel Proust's À la recherche du temps perdu, In Search of a Lost or Time Gone By, where just the sniff or the taste of some tea and some Madeleine cake brings back memories for the speaker in that novel, that goes on to fill 8 more books of memories. It's the same kind of sense of one little sniff of these flowers explodes into this memory of childhood. So the next step today is to start bringing your notes so far together. So you've now covered 3 poems by Heaney and 3 poems by Harwood. There should be enough for you there to start kind of composing, not necessarily composing an essay, but at least composing a scaffold for how you might express some ideas about the poems. To start you off, I would suggest that you use either explore kind of how a couple of the poems explore innocence and experience and kind of how that transition between them, or you could look at rites of passage and what actually brings about that change or the loss of the innocence that we see in some of the poems. Or you could simply look at representations of childhood and adulthood and what the poets are saying about that, about those 2 states of being. So pick one of those 3 themes and start putting some bullet point notes together, and hopefully come up with some topic sentences about what you might say that you've learned so far about these ideas from the poems we've studied. Best of luck, and we'll see you next lesson.